You have no idea what you've just inherited.
Promise me you won't run.
I wondered if anyone would ever come. I thought I'd take it to my grave.
Clara found the envelope taped inside her mailbox at 6 in the morning. No stamp, no name. Just 3 words scrawled across the front in handwriting that made her stomach drop before she even opened it. Don't trust them. Her hands were still unsteady from the funeral 2 days earlier. Elias Grant, the richest man she had ever cared for, gone in his sleep after 2 long years of quietly failing health. And now she was standing on a cracked sidewalk in Ohio, staring at words written in a hand she recognized instantly, because she had watched that same hand grow weaker and weaker over 2 years of holding pill bottles and pens. It was Elias's handwriting, and Elias had been dead for 2 days. If you're just joining this story, welcome. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, tap the like, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from tonight, because this one is going to stay with you long after it ends. Clara Whitmore had grown up the daughter of a mechanic in a town so small it didn't have a stoplight, just a 4-way stop everyone still argued over. She learned early that people who had nothing were often the most generous, and people who had everything were often the loneliest. She carried that lesson into nursing school, into the small apartment she rented above a laundromat, and eventually into the enormous, echoing house on the hill where Elias Grant had spent the last 2 years of his life slowly disappearing behind a diagnosis nobody wanted to say out loud. She had been hired through an agency. She had no idea, when she walked through those iron gates for the first time, that the old man inside them was one of the wealthiest people in the country. A man whose name sat on hospital wings and university buildings. A man whose obituary, when it ran 2 days ago, was picked up by every major outlet in America. All she knew, that first week, was that he was difficult, guarded, and impossibly lonely, and that none of his family had visited in the 4 months she'd been there. Not one. She never asked him for anything. Not a raise, though she deserved one. Not gifts, though he offered, more than once, in that gruff, testing way rich men do when they want to see who you really are. She simply showed up, did her job, read to him when his eyes grew too tired for the newspaper, and sat with him in silence when silence was what he needed. Somewhere in the second year, he stopped treating her like staff and started treating her like the only person left who actually saw him. The night before he died, he had gripped her wrist with a strength that startled her and whispered, "Promise me you won't run." She had thought, at the time, it was the fog of dying talking, the way people sometimes reach for meanings that dissolve before they land. Standing at her mailbox now, envelope trembling in her hand, she understood she'd been wrong. She tore it open right there on the sidewalk. Inside was a single page, written in the same shaking hand. Dated, she checked twice, 14 months before his death. Asterisk if you're reading this, they've already come for you. I'm sorry I couldn't warn you sooner, but I needed to know you were the kind of person who wouldn't run at the first sign of trouble. Go to the law office on Monday. Whatever they tell you in that room, don't react. Not until you're alone with me, with these words. There's more to this than money, Clara. There always was, asterisk. She had no idea what law office meant, or why a dead man was giving her instructions. She folded the letter into her coat pocket with hands that had gone completely cold, and 3 days later, a phone call came from a firm in Manhattan asking her to appear at a reading of the will. She assumed it was a courtesy. She wore her one good dress, the navy one from her sister's wedding, and sat in the back of a conference room full of people who looked at her like she'd wandered in from the wrong building. Elias's son, Marcus, sharp-jawed in a suit that cost more than her car, glanced at her once and didn't look at her again. The lawyer, a woman named Priya Adeyemi, cleared her throat and began to read. And the room went very, very quiet. Elias Grant had left the bulk of his estate, the house, the majority shares in Grant Holdings, a portfolio worth an amount Clara would need 3 tries to say out loud without her voice cracking, to Clara Whitmore. Not to his son, not to his ex-wife, not to the foundation that bore his name. To her. Marcus stood so fast his chair clattered backward. This is insane, he said, his voice shaking with something that wasn't grief. She's a nurse. She was paid to be here. He turned on Clara, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that made the hair on her arms rise. Not just anger. Fear. You have no idea what you've just inherited, he said. She thought of the envelope in her coat pocket. There's more to this than money, Clara. There always was. Nobody in that room, including her, understood yet how true that sentence was. The first threat arrived 4 days later, and it wasn't threatening at all, not on the surface. A man in a gray coat introduced himself as a representative of the Grant family and offered her, on Marcus's behalf, an amount of money that made her hands shake, if she would simply sign a document declining the inheritance and walk away quietly. No lawyers, no press, just a clean, generous exit. You don't want this kind of attention, he told her, not unkindly. People like you don't survive people like them. She thought about her promise, the one she hadn't even known she was making, gripped tight around a dying man's wrist. Promise me you won't run. She said no. If this story is starting to get under your skin the way it did for me, go ahead and drop a comment below and let me know. And if you haven't already, hit that like button, because it really helps stories like this reach the people who need to hear them. That night, she took the first letter out again and read the line she'd skimmed past in her panic. Whatever they tell you in that room, don't react. Not until you're alone with me. With these words. She realized then that Elias hadn't just predicted the buyout. He'd choreographed her response to it, months in advance, from a bed he already knew he wouldn't leave. The next morning, she called Priya Adeyemi and asked the only question that felt right. Is there more? Is there something else he left me? There was a long silence on the line, long enough that Clara thought the call had dropped. I need you to come to my office, Priya finally said. Alone. And Ms. Whitmore, don't tell anyone you're coming. The office on the 31st floor smelled like old paper and expensive coffee, and Priya looked, for the first time since Clara had met her, genuinely unsettled. She slid a second envelope across the desk, thick with more than paper. Mr. Grant gave me this 14 months ago, she said. He was very specific. If you ever came asking whether there was more, I was to give you this, and only you. He said if his son asked, I was to say I knew nothing. Clara opened it with fingers that didn't feel entirely her own. Inside was a longer letter and a photograph of a young woman she didn't recognize, standing in front of a small brick house. The letter told a story Elias Grant had apparently carried alone for 4 decades. His first wife, Marcus's mother, had died in a house fire almost 40 years earlier. Clara had heard the story once, in passing, from a housekeeper who'd gone quiet, and strange the moment she realized what she'd said out loud. Elias had suspected for years that it wasn't an accident, a faulty investigation, a convenient insurance payout, a teenage stepson who vanished from the family not long after, sent to boarding school and quietly written out of every document that mattered. He'd never been able to prove it. He'd spent decades doing what frightened, wealthy men do with unbearable truths, burying them under money, distance, and silence. But the guilt hadn't stayed buried. In his final years, dying with nothing left to lose, he'd started quietly reopening the case himself, hiring an investigator under a false name, chasing a truth his own family had spent 40 years trying to keep sealed shut. The photograph was of Rosalind, his late wife's younger sister, the one witness who had once told police she smelled gasoline the night of the fire, and who had been quietly paid to recant. I couldn't fix what I did, Elias had written. I chose money over truth for 40 years, and it turned my own son into someone who would do anything to keep that truth buried, including making sure you never find Rosalind. That's why I left you everything, Clara. Not because you deserve my money. Because you never asked me for anything, not once in 2 years, and that told me exactly who you were. You were the only person strong enough and honest enough to finally do what I never could. If your stomach just dropped the way mine did the first time I heard this part, comment below and tell me. Because we are far from finished, and if you love stories that twist right when you think you understand them, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next changes everything. Clara sat in that office a long time, the photograph trembling in her hand, finally understanding the full weight of what Elias Grant had left her. Not a fortune, a responsibility, A decades-old secret his own son had apparently spent his entire adult life protecting, which meant the buyout offer had never been about money at all. It had been about making her disappear before she found this envelope. Does Marcus know this exists? Clara asked quietly. Priya's face was pale. I don't know what Marcus knows, but his lawyers have called this office 4 times this week asking whether Mr. Grant left any, quote, supplementary documents. I told them no. She hesitated. I don't think they believed me. That night, Clara didn't go home. She checked into a motel under her sister's maiden name, the photograph of Rosalind tucked inside her jacket, and stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying every quiet, careful conversation she'd ever had with Elias, searching for signs she'd missed. The way he flinched at the smell of wood smoke drifting through a window. The way he kept a single photograph locked in his desk drawer he never let her see. The way he'd once said, out of nowhere, the people who deserve the truth are usually the ones who get lied to the longest, then changed the subject before she could ask what he meant. He had been preparing her the entire time, testing her, not for greed, for character, and she had passed a test she never knew she was taking. Finding Rosalind took 11 days, 3 false addresses, and one terrifying afternoon when Clara was certain a black sedan had followed her rental car for 6 miles outside Hartford before finally turning off. She found the woman, 81 years old and sharp-eyed, living alone outside a town so quiet it barely had a name. When Clara showed her the photograph, Rosalind's hands shook so badly she had to set down her tea. I wondered if anyone would ever come, she said. I thought I'd take it to my grave. What Rosalind told her, over 3 hours and 2 pots of coffee, confirmed everything Elias had suspected, and something he never had. Marcus's older half-brother hadn't acted alone that night. He'd had help, a family friend, eager to please, who went on decades later to become one of the most powerful men on the Grant Holdings board. A man who still sat 2 seats down from Marcus at every shareholder meeting. A man with every reason in the world to make sure this story never surfaced. This was the emotional peak the story had been building toward. And if it's hitting you the way it hit me, go ahead and like this video right now and tell me in the comments how you'd feel in Clara's position, because what she did next took a kind of courage most people never have to find. Clara had a choice. She could take what she'd learned to a journalist and blow the story open, risking her safety and possibly her life. She could take it to the police, where a 40-year-old case with a paid-off witness might simply vanish into bureaucracy the way it had once before. Or she could do what Elias, in his letter, had quietly hoped she might be brave enough to do. Go straight to Marcus himself. She chose the hardest option. She requested a meeting. Marcus arrived expecting a negotiation over money. Instead, Clara slid the photograph of Rosalind across the table, along with a folder containing a sworn, notarized statement Rosalind had finally agreed to give, and watched the color drain from his face in real time. You knew, Clara said quietly. Not about the fire, maybe, but you knew your father was digging into something. That's why you tried so hard to buy me off before I found it. You weren't protecting his legacy. You were protecting your seat on that board. Marcus didn't deny it. That silence told her everything. What happened over the following months would eventually make headlines Clara never wanted her name attached to. A quiet, devastating restructuring of Grant Holdings, a board member's abrupt and unexplained resignation, an investigation that never fully resolved in a courtroom but permanently, irreversibly resolved in the only place that mattered to Clara, an old woman's front room, where the truth was finally spoken out loud after 40 years of silence. Clara never publicized the inheritance. She quietly restructured most of it into a trust, one that funded nursing scholarships, elder care programs, and eventually a small fund in Rosalind's name to support witnesses too frightened to come forward in cases just like this one. She kept a modest portion for herself, enough to finally help her own aging parents, enough to breathe for the first time in her adult life, but nothing close to the empire she could have claimed. Because in the end, she understood something Elias Grant had spent 40 years learning the hard way, that the money had never been the inheritance that mattered. The truth was, and the courage to carry it, even when carrying it was dangerous, even when everyone around her had every incentive to make her put it down. She never asked him for anything. That's exactly why, when it mattered most, he trusted her with everything. Before we close this one out, I want you to sit with that for a second, because somewhere out there tonight, Someone is quietly doing the right thing with no expectation of ever being rewarded for it, the same way Clara did. If this story moved you even a little, subscribe, share it with someone who needs a reminder that integrity still means something. And tell me in the comments the biggest lesson you're taking away tonight. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't the one written into a will. It's the one we choose to become worthy of long before anyone's watching.